Greetings, book lovers everywhere. I'm E-Train and welcome to E-Train Talks. And today I am super thrilled to be interviewing anthropologist Dr. Ruth Behar. And I want to take a moment to thank you to everybody who just listens and supports my podcast. It's been an amazing journey of sharing what I love most, stories. And it just seemed like the perfect day to send out my gratitude because I'm so thankful to be talking with Ruth Behar today. She is an incredibly talented and thoughtful, award-winning storyteller, poet, and anthropologist. Ruth's background is so interesting. She was born in Havana, Cuba, to a Jewish-Cuban family of Sephardic Turkish and Ashkenazi Polish descent. And her colorful Jewish background is seen and felt throughout the pages of her stories. And I'm so thrilled to have Ruth joining E-Train Talks today to share her writing journey with us. And I had the honor of meeting Ruth in a library book club Zoom a while ago after reading the beautiful letters from Cuba. And it's a really big treat for me to have Ruth join me on my podcast. And so without further delay, thank you so much for joining me today, Ruth.
Thank you, E-Train. This is such a pleasure for me. I'm so thrilled about what you're doing to promote literacy and books. It's so beautiful. And I'm so honored that you wanted to speak to me. And I think you really understand what I'm doing in my work and the nuances and all these different dimensions of identity and culture that I'm exploring in my fiction. I feel like you really get it. So it's very exciting to talk to you.
Well, it's very exciting to talk to you as well. I've been anticipating this interview for a long time, ever since we scheduled it, which wasn't that long ago, but I'm just so glad that we can talk about your stories. And first of all, in your book Letters from Cuba, the protagonist Esther is forced to move from Poland to Havana and ends up living with her father. They make a living by becoming traveling merchants, but soon Esther discovers her hidden talent, sewing. Do you sew? And if so, who taught you? Also, were any of the events in the story based on your real-life experiences?
Okay, great questions. Well, first of all, the book itself is based on my grandmother's story. The little bit that I knew of it, which was that she was the first to go to Cuba of all the children in her family and meet up with her father and then help to bring everybody out of Poland as the war was about to start. Of course, they didn't know the war was about to start, but they knew that terrible things were happening. And so I always knew that part of the story, but I didn't know what her day-to-day life had been like in Cuba. I guess that's always very hard to know. Okay, you got to Cuba, you helped save the family, but what did you do? What did you have for breakfast? Those are things that I didn't know. So that was why the novel came about, so that I could fill in and try to imagine the life of a Jewish Polish girl in Cuba in that time period. So that was really the first inspiration. And then the sewing worked out because I was trying to think, well, what could she do to help bring the whole family? And in real life, she sold fabric. So she was involved in the fabric business, but I wanted it to be a little bit more interesting than that. And my grandmother liked to sew, but mostly it was her sisters who did a lot of sewing. And she had one sister who was quite lovely, Dora, who I knew, who used to sew and used to fix the hems of my dresses. And I just thought, oh, well, sewing is part of the family and making dresses is part of the family. And a lot of Jewish people were involved in what gets called the shmata trade, the trade in rags. That's what shmatas are. So I knew that fabric and cloth and tailoring and sewing were very important, Jewish practices, and it had been part of my family's heritage. And then my grandparents later on had a lace store in Havana, so they were very involved with fabric and lace and sewing and dresses. So it seemed to make sense. And I just kind of dramatized it a little bit more. So we have the young Esther, initially making a dress for herself, because that was the first thing I had to imagine. What would it be like to arrive from Poland where it's really, really cold and you get to Cuba and, it's sunshine all year. And so she's wearing a woolen dress, I'm imagining, and woolen stockings, and it's really hot. but they don't have enough money to get anything else. So she has to wear this heavy clothing in that terrible heat. But then eventually she can get some cloth and some thread and be able to sew. And her mother, before leaving Poland, she gives her a thimble, right, as a kind of a going away gift. It's something small and portable that she can take with her. And it's her mother who's taught her how to sew. But her mother didn't realize like how well she learned her lessons in sewing. And it's when she gets to Cuba and realizes she needs a new dress, and starts also giving dresses away to the neighbors that she meets in the small town where they go to live in Cuba. She starts realizing I can do this. I have a gift for this, and so that's how it became the focus of the story.
Well, Esther is truly one of my favorite protagonists of all time. And what really speaks to me about Letters from Cuba is that my great-grandfather also came to the U.S. He didn't go to Cuba, but he did come to the U.S. He immigrated here from Poland. So I have a lot of Jewish Polish descent. So like reading about Esther's experiences, well, they weren't exactly like my great-grandfather's. I knew that they were similar and they left for the same reasons. For religious freedom, they knew that a lot of bad things were happening in their country and they needed to escape. So I just loved that there were so many similarities between Esther's life and my great-grandfather's, because it really gives me, I never knew him. So kind of getting to read about what would happen to a Jewish Polish immigrant who was a kid and immigrated from Poland. I loved that aspect of the story.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is pretty unusual because we do have a lot of narratives of Polish Jewish or Russian Jewish young immigrants, but going to the United States. And those are really important and great stories that definitely influenced me. But I thought it's very unusual to hear about the people who went to Cuba. And so I thought, well, this could be something interesting to share. And then I was thinking a lot about child immigrants in general and the immigrants coming over from across the border into the United States, and back in that period when they were putting kids in cages that were trying to cross over to be together with their families. So I had all of that in my mind, and then I said, wait a minute, but this has happened in my family. My grandmother went on her own to Cuba, and she was separated from her family for a while. So I thought, oh, there's a lot here that we have in common with what's going on today. And so that was one of the reasons too that I wanted to tell the story.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you did tell the story. And I read that when you were younger, you kept a diary. So how long did you write in your diary? And do you still have it? And do you ever refer to it when you're writing books?
Well, I did keep a diary. I started when I was about 10, and that was my first diary. And it's a little red book that had a key to open and close it. And I don't have the key anymore. I had to break it open to be able to get into the diary. But I have that. It's got like gilded gold pages. And fortunately, it stayed at my parents' house in New York. And then at some point when I was looking through things in their attic, I found it. And so I have it with me. And I do glance at it now and then and look back and go, oh, wow, so that was how I thought, or that was how I wrote then, or that was my handwriting. These were the things going on in my mind. And I did have a lot of interesting thoughts back then, a lot of concerns about the family, a lot of concerns about were we going to manage financially? Just a lot of worries that clearly my parents were talking about, things that I, as a young person, was listening to and kind of worrying and wasn't sure how these problems would be resolved. So some of those things were in the diary. And then I continued. I had these composition notebooks later in middle school and in high school that I kept on a pretty regular basis, and I have those as well, and look through them now and then. So I was a pretty serious diary keeper, I would say, pretty much until I went to college, and then I got too busy and didn't really keep it up so well. But then I started writing more poems and stories and essays. So things that I would have written in a diary form started being written in a more, I guess, polished form. But I've gone back to the diary now at this stage of my life, and I have a diary that I keep on my computer, and it's not that regular, but like, for example, today I had some time And I was kind of catching up with myself and writing notes about like the things that had happened in the last 2, 3 weeks that I hadn't had a chance to think about. So I was kind of processing some of that in my diary. So I think keeping a diary is a really great thing to do. It just kind of allows you to check in with yourself on a regular basis.
Yeah, it does sound like an amazing thing to have. I need a diary. I always like tell myself I'm gonna write it, but then it kind of turns into like its own little story. It's not even about me anymore. Like it just gives me I just never go back to it. But I think that having a diary, just being able to reflect on what's happened in your life is always so important, whether it's in a diary form or journal form, or maybe you're writing books like Letters from Cuba or TF Fortuna's New Home.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think getting those scenes down in a diary form where you're just kind of writing and you know that you can give yourself permission to say anything you want because you're not expecting anybody to read it. When I think about my diaries, I don't expect anybody to ever read them. These are just like very raw statements and things. And so it kind of allows you to get all of that down on the page, which I think frees you up to then tell the stories, to then write the fiction and the novels and so on. So yes, I think it's, and some of it can end up in the fiction too. Like I was writing some notes today, and I thought, oh, maybe I can use this phrase, in something that I'm writing now. So it can be very helpful that way. It's like exercising the writing muscles is really good.
And speaking of something you're writing now, I'm really curious to know, do you have any book projects, whether it's middle grade, picture books, or YA in the works?
I do. So I'm working on a new middle grade novel right now, which I
Ooh,
hope I can finish by around October. So I mean, it's all written, but it's going
yeah.
through several revisions. So that one, the title is undecided, so I won't share any of the potential titles, but it is a Sephardic novel, so it kind of follows on the Tia Fortuna story, but much more ambitious because it takes place in 4 different time periods with 4 different characters living in 4 different times, and then their stories converge at the end. So that's a lot of fun to write, and but it's very challenging because I've never written anything
Yeah.
like that from 4 perspectives, and I'm enjoying it a lot. So I'm writing that. It takes place in Spain and Turkey and Cuba and in Miami, so like 4 different locations. And yeah, so that's taking up most of my energy now. I'm on a brief pause, but I'll be coming back to it next week. So that's mainly what I'm working on now. But I'm also very excited that I have 2 book projects with my son. So we
Ooh.
decided to write together. And that I know that is just so great. So my son Gabriel, who's a filmmaker and also a writer, he has an MFA in creative writing and then a film degree as well, and he teaches film. And so after writing Tia Fortuna, I had an idea for another picture book, and I suggested that he co-write it with me. And that book will be out next fall, and it's called Pepita Meets Babita, and it's a story based a little bit on his life and his wife's life. It's about probably heard about this. It's about a very sweet puppy who's used to being the baby of the family, and then a human baby comes into the family, and Pepita has to learn how to live with Babita. So we wrote that together, and it's being illustrated by a wonderful artist in Spain, and very excited that'll come out in fall of 23, so in about a year from now. And then we have another book that we wrote together that I can't say too much about yet, but it found a publisher, and that one we also wrote together, a different topic, but also a co-written book, and we hope we can write more books together. And I hope that he will also be soon writing his own books. So that was a lot of fun. That was like a really, collaborating on writing is really fun when you get each other as we do. And that was just an amazing experience. So I'm really looking forward to those 2 books coming out soon.
Well, I can't wait for them to come out either. And the first middle grade book you talked about, which is taking up a lot of your energy, it sounds a lot like Refugee by Alan Gratz, which I also loved. So I know I'm going to absolutely adore all the books you're writing, and I love co-written stories, especially when they're from family members. It's like a real bonding experience. You get to spend time with the people you care about, and you're both doing something that you care about.
Totally, totally. And I'm glad you mentioned Alan Gratz because Refugee was definitely an inspiration for this new novel I'm working on. I admire that novel so much and all of his others as well. I think he's really a master of the multiple point of view story and really, really
Even
love that, particularly love that one.
put a
Do you
little
have it there?
review at the top of Letters from Cuba as well.
Yes, exactly. He was so kind and generous as well in supporting my work, and he supports the work of many other writers. So that's always really nice. That generosity is always really amazing. And it's just such a great book. I've read it many times just to learn about the craft
Hmm.
from him, which I can't possibly do as well as he does, but I'm doing my best to do a version of it. It's not exactly written like his, but it's inspired by that notion of the multiple points of view. So I really, really like that. And yeah, and working with somebody that you love, as I love my son, working together on a book has been really, really just one of the best experiences ever. So we can't wait for that book to come out.
Yeah, I cannot wait either. And I'm always interested in learning what goes on behind the scenes of books. And since Letters from Cuba takes place nearly 100 years ago, and of course, all the stories you write, there has to be a little bit of research that goes into them. So I'm guessing you have to do some research on immigrants, day-to-day lives of some of the characters, like because they're in different time periods, and so much more. So what sources did you use, and how much research did you conduct before your books are finished? Like, how much research do you usually do?
Yeah, well, it varies. For Letters from Cuba, I did do a lot of research. Now,
Hmm.
I had been traveling to Cuba for many years, going back and forth and getting to know the place where I was born and researching the Jewish community. And I wrote a book about the Jewish community in Cuba, an anthropological book. And then I also made a movie about the Sephardic Jews of Cuba. So I'd actually done a lot of research and getting to know the story of the Jews of Cuba, the Jews still living on the island today, who are a very small number, about now maybe about 800 people. So very, very tiny community still on the island that I got to know and study and photograph and listen to their stories, all of that. So that was a big part of it. But then because, as you said, the book was historical and taking place, 100 years ago or more, that required a lot of research. So I did research on the history of the Jews in Cuba, on their migration, the settlements, where they came from, what their lives were like. There are several historians who've looked at that. And then the other thing I did is I read letters by immigrants, not necessarily immigrants in Cuba, but Jewish immigrants, Irish immigrants, Polish immigrants. Fortunately, they're historians who have collected the letters of immigrants. And I checked out those books from the library just to see how immigrants thought about their lives and how they wrote letters at that time. And that was very important research as well. And then, being an anthropologist, I went to the town of Agramonte, where the book is set. The book is set in the countryside. I decided it would be more interesting to set it there than in Havana because we know so much about Havana. We have so many books, even though I absolutely love
Hmm.
Havana, La Habana, where I was born. But I thought, no, I'm going to make it even more interesting and set it in the countryside, which is where my grandmother and her family lived when they arrived in Cuba. So I decided to set it in Agramonte, and I went to Agramonte. I'd been a few times before, but then I went and stayed there several days. I stayed with a family. They were very, very nice, very open and welcoming, and just hung out with them. And then they introduced me to people in the town that are really, just very excited about the history of their town. And they shared old photographs with me and other materials. And then I got to see a lot of the Afro-Cuban religious ceremonies as well, and all of that found its way into the book. So it was kind of lived research and also historical research, and all of that went into Letters from Cuba. My other books also require research, but not on that level, because also Lucky Broken Girl, which is based on my life, I had to do some
Yeah.
research on the 1960s because that period, that took place some years ago, even
Yeah.
though I lived it. But I had to find out like what was going on in 1966 in history, and so that required some research. And I went back to my old neighborhood in New York, and so I did that kind of research and talked to my family about their memories. So that was a little different. It wasn't quite as intense as Letters from Cuba, but I feel that all my books require definitely some research, some anchoring in real life.
Yeah. And speaking of the letters format of Letters from Cuba, this isn't really a question, but it is a comment. So in fourth grade, we had to write about immigrants and we had to like kind of create our own immigrants. And we had to like write 5 letters from them to specific family members, whether it's maybe their sister, if they have a sibling, their parents. And I was really inspired by Letters from Cuba because it's written in the letter format, which I absolutely love. When I find a novel that's written in that sort of format, it just steals my heart from the start, which rhymes. Yeah. I
That's
I
nice.
just loved Letters from Cuba, and I just wanted to say that before we continue. And so I know that you're published by the wonderful Nancy Paulson, who I also interviewed. And I'm curious to know, what was the publication process like for your books? Did each story produce new challenges?
Absolutely. Well, let me say, I'm glad you interviewed Nancy Paulson. She is totally amazing. She's just the greatest
Yeah.
editor. I love working with her and hope she'll want to keep working with me because I want to keep working with her. I think she's just amazing. And all the books, that she
Yeah.
works on, that she edits are amazing books. And the kind of attention that she gives her authors is just incredible. And so I love working with her and getting into conversations about, my book as it's emerging. So with each book, it is a little bit different in that, each of my books has been a different story and so on. But she's just great to work with because she really, really gets into the stories and asks really good questions about how it's written. Like, are you writing it the best possible way you can? She asks about the characters, she'll even do like a little background research herself and go, well, what about this? Did you know about this? I go, wow, Nancy's really researching things. So that makes the process so amazing. And we'll go through several versions. Like she'll give me some comments and then I will revise, trying to respond as best I can to her comments and suggestions. And then she'll look at it again and then she'll send me more comments. And then sometimes I'll have questions and I'll send those to her and say, what do you think? Should I want to make this change or that change? So it's really just an incredible process to it's like thinking through the book, with somebody that you really, really trust, like a guide that's going to take you through this dark tunnel, to the light at the end of the tunnel. And that's what it's like working with Nancy. So it's very, very exciting. And just even, like sometimes I'll have more than one ending this happened to me with both books, with Lucky Broken Girl and Letters from Cuba. I had ideas for different endings and going, I'm not sure which one's the best. And sharing them with Nancy and then just getting like her feedback and just kind of helping me to see like the best way to bring the story to closure. So yeah, it's like having just like a really wise person, holding your hand during this process that's so scary when, you want to share this book with the world, but you just don't know if it's any good. And Nancy can really help you to see what's good in the work and what still needs more revision to make it the best it can be.
Yeah, Nancy is amazing. It's always great to have a person like that in your corner. And it's I when I get published, because I hope to write a book in the future, I want to have a publisher like Nancy who actually, like, you're doing all the research for your book, but you're not alone. You know that your publisher or your editor is also doing research to help along your journey. It sounds like the best feeling ever. And I know that maybe I won't get published by Nancy, but I want to be published or edited by somebody like her. And it must have been a great experience.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you said it so well. That is so true. It was and continues to be a great experience. I'm so thrilled and honored that now I'm working on my third middle grade novel with Nancy.
Yeah, and I can't wait to read it, and I'm sure everybody listening is as well. And now on to your first picture book. Tia Fortuna's New Home, A Jewish-Cuban Journey. So I loved everything about Tia Fortuna's New Home. It's just, the illustrations for one are beautiful. And
Mhm.
there's also a wonderful message of family, hope, and traditions. I mean, of course, the protagonist's name is Estrella, which is stars, and just that name gives me hope. I love the name Estrella. I'm curious to know, did you have a special relationship with your Tia? And would you say you're kind of like Estrella?
Yeah, no, good question. So the story was inspired by a tia, by an aunt that I love very much, who lives in Miami Beach, and I visit her often.
Hmm.
And she's my father's younger sister, so she's one of my Sephardic aunts, and so I've learned a lot of the traditions from her, and I love how she speaks Spanish. It's just so beautiful and musical, her Spanish. So we always talk in Spanish. So I love that. And she just has lots of stories to share about her mother, my grandmother, and proverbs and cooking and so on. So I just like being in touch with her, being in contact with her. So she was an inspiration, but Tia Fortuna is also different from my aunt, and I had to make that very clear to my tia once the book came out, because she said, well, that's not exactly what I'm like. And I said, no, well, it's not all of you. It was inspired by you, but it's also a fictional tia. So I had to tell her that. But just thinking about the relationship between a child and an aunt, as opposed to, say, a grandmother or grandfather, which are kind of the more common representations that we see. I thought, well, what about if I focus on an aunt, on a tia, instead of an abuela? And so that's kind of where I started. And then the name Fortuna is in my family, and it's just such a beautiful name. I mean, just fortune or good luck that somebody, in Hebrew, often people are named Mazal as like a first name. And I just think, wow, that's so beautiful just to be called luck, or fortune. And so I love the name. I've heard it a lot in the Sephardic community and just wanted a character named Tia Fortuna. I just think it's so beautiful. So I decided that I would call my aunt, the fictional aunt, Tia
Yeah.
Fortuna, and and then write about an aunt who has to leave her home, because it's going to be demolished to build a fancy hotel. And then Estrella, yeah, Estrella is me. When I was writing it, I definitely thought, oh, I'm like this child Estrella. I have a lovely aunt, and I just want to spend time with her and help her out during this difficult moment. And it is another, Estrella is another common name in the Sephardic community. It's such a beautiful name as well. When I finished the book, I realized that, yeah, I had been Estrella, but now I'm practically old enough to be Tia Fortuna myself. So when I thought about it later, I thought, well, I'm sort of both characters. I think when you write, this is something I should share, that I think when you write a book, the author is present in every character in the story to some extent. A piece of us is present, even in characters that seem very different from us. There's something of us is in each character. So I think something of me is definitely in Tia Fortuna, and something of me is in Estrella. And sometimes I think I could be Tia Fortuna now because I'm old enough to be. And sometimes I think, no, but I'm still that child learning from my tia to this day. So I like the idea that I can be both, and I just love, the affection that they have for each other, and how Tia's trying to make the day seem as positive and happy as she can, and she doesn't want Estrella to be sad, and Estrella's trying her best to be supportive of her tia. So they're both kind of navigating this difficult day of saying goodbye to one home and starting anew in a different home.
Well, I adored the storyline of Tia Fortuna's new home. And I think what you're saying is so true. You don't see many storylines, just stories at all about an aunt. Like, I see, like you said, grandparents, maybe parents, but like, I have an amazing relationship with my aunt. She's someone that I want to have in my corner at all times. You don't want to get on her bad side. And I just love Tia Fortuna as a character. And while she doesn't really remind me of my aunt, it's just so nice to see that, like, they're just Because I don't know where I'd be without my aunt. And seeing that Estrella is the same way, like I could really relate to Estrella and really all the characters. Because, like you said, there's a piece of an author in all the characters, but there's also a piece of a reader, which I love.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely. Well, that's so important, is creating that relationship with the reader, and that's what we're always doing as writers. We're writing, and at first we're writing for ourselves, and then maybe for our families, maybe for an editor like Nancy Paulson, and then you hope that there will be readers like you that understand the story and need the story and find inspiration in the story to think about their own relationships. Now you're thinking about the relationship with your aunt, and how maybe you want to cherish that relationship in a new way now that you're conscious of it. So I think that's what's so wonderful about stories, is that they raise this awareness that maybe we had, but just kind of bringing it up, yet one more level, and making our lives richer that way.
So I'm guessing that having such a rich cultural background has given you the opportunity to try many unique and tasty dishes from all over the world. So is there a food or dish that you especially love, or one that holds special meaning to you?
Well, I'll tell you some from each place where I've lived. In Spain, it's the tortilla española, the delicious potato omelets that they make, sometimes with onion and sometimes without. There's a big debate in Spain as to whether to make it with onions or not. I like it both ways.
Mhm.
So tortilla española, delicious. And then in Mexico, the gorditas. I love gorditas, like fat tortillas stuffed with, potato and egg, coming back to potato and egg, or with roasted chiles. I love gorditas. And then from the Sephardic tradition, and this appears in Tia Fortuna, the borrecas. I love the borrecas. It's kind of like a Sephardic gordita in a way, because it's also a doughy pastry, filled with things like potato and cheese again, or with spinach. And I love those. And then from my Cuban tradition, there's nothing better and more soothing than a plate of black beans over rice with a little bit of chopped onion. That's a favorite and very, very homey dish that I grew up on. So those are some of the favorites that I think about all the time. And then of course I love matzo ball soup too.
And now it's time for my final question, the question I ask every single one of my guests. If you could be
Mhm.
or meet any literary character, literally anybody, literally, literally any character from any book, or maybe an author or an advocate for reading, if you could meet anybody related to books, who would it be and why?
Oh my, this is a really hard question, but I was thinking about it, and well, there's several, but I'll start with one that may sound funny. Well, Kafka wrote Metamorphosis, and he has the character Gregor Samsa, who one day wakes up and has been turned into an insect. And I've always felt for that character, who's then treated really badly by his family. And that idea of waking up one day and being an insect, I thought, oh, I wouldn't mind, like, spending a little time with Gregor Samsa and holding Gregor Samsa's hand once he's turned into a bug. Even though I don't really like bugs, but this would be a special one. So that came to mind as a as a literary character who I think is so interesting. But in terms of authors who once lived that I would love to get to know, if I had a moment with them in person, I think the poet Emily Dickinson would be one of the great literary figures that I would love to spend just even 10 minutes with, in her house in Amherst, and just as she's writing a poem and saving it under her bed, under her mattress. That would be pretty amazing. So those are some that come to mind.
Well, those are such wonderful answers. And I just love the book title Metamorphosis. Wow, that is so beautiful in just one word. Because metamorphosis is it's such just a magnificent, like, part of nature. Like, it's kind of, you're going from a caterpillar, a small little insect, to becoming a butterfly and spreading your wings. So I need to read that story. And I also would love to meet Emily Dickinson. And I'm a fan of all things poetry. So it would be
Um,
great to meet like an actual poet. I know that I've met, like, just go to their house. That would be a very fun experience. And everybody, my guest today has been the wonderful, wonderful Ruth Behar. It's been such a delight chatting with you today about Letters from Cuba, Tia Fortuna's New Home, and Lucky Broken Girl. So, Ruth Behar has a PhD in anthropology, so that's why she's known as Dr. Ruth Behar. And anthropology is such an interesting, well, super duper interesting, just field. I would love to just work in the anthropological. Is that a word? Okay,
It
that is a word.
certainly is.
I just wanted to make sure. Um, it, I would love to work in the anthropological field. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to chat everything books with me, Ruth. It's been such an honor. You are an amazing person.
Oh, well, thank you so much, E-Train. I'm so honored to have been with you, and this time has gone so quickly. I could talk
Yeah.
for hours with you, so thank you so much. And definitely look up anthropology as well, because I think studying anthropology can make you a more perceptive writer, because you're thinking about different cultures and different people and listening to people's stories. And so I think that can be a good way to build up your thoughts and your skills as a writer. So, yeah. So, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure and an honor for me too.